Welcome to the Catskill Review of Books, a weekly program interviewing authors, hosted by Ian Williams and produced by Kevin Greff in the hydro-powered studios of WJFF in Jeffersonville, New York.
Hello, this is Ian Williams with the Catskill Review of Books, and this week I'm talking to Christopher Kelly, who wrote the book America Invades, How We've Been Invaded or Militarily Involved with Almost Every Country on Earth. And Christopher, you got this... you were sort of part inspired by Stuart Laycock, weren't you, who did a similar job for the Brits beforehand and helped you with this one?
Yes, Ian, great to be with you. My co-author is Stuart Laycock, and he wrote a book called All the Countries We've Invaded and the Few We Never Got Around to. And that was published in 2012, and in that book he talks about how Britain invaded 90% of all the countries in the world as listed by the UN based on modern geography. And so I read that book and I was fascinated by it. I reviewed it, sent him a copy of the review. I'd never met Stu before. And we became friends, met in a pub in London. And as an American, my question was, I found your book interesting, but how does America compare to Britain? We don't have as much history, but we've been catching up, so to speak, in the invasion category.
It's hyperactivity, I think, on the military front.
Exactly.
One of the points that comes out in your book is, a lot of us sort of think of America emerging from isolationism after World War II and being dragged reluctantly into the global stage. But you document cases where almost from the foundation of the Republic, and in some cases before, American forces have been involved up and down the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, and in Central America and Latin America as well.
That's right. Yeah, there are very few places in the world where America has not reached in some way. I mean, we've invaded about 85 countries according to our definition of invasion, which is armed Americans in a foreign country, fighting in a foreign country, and we've been militarily involved with almost all the rest. I mean, that out of 194 countries in the UN, excluding the U.S. itself, we've been involved with 191, all but 3. The only 3 we've missed are Andorra, Bhutan, and Liechtenstein thus far.
Yeah, and I gather you've gone to Liechtenstein recently just to make up that deficiency. Did you carry the flag?
I did actually have a brief personal invasion of Liechtenstein, but recently. And so, and it was interesting to know. I mean, even though they've been demilitarized, they eliminated their army in 1868. And they managed to avoid both world wars. But no, we haven't. It may be some future president may have that on a to-do list. But as of now, we haven't been involved in those 3: Andorra, Bhutan, or Liechtenstein.
Yes, but I mean, some of the other micro-states have benefited had the dubious benefit of American military attention, haven't they? Like San Marino and Monaco.
San Marino and the Vatican, for instance. I mean, that we even found some things after this book's publication of additional involvements where American jeeps, went into St. Peter's Square and accidentally crossed the line, so to speak, and had to be escorted back by the Swiss guards.
What, did the Swiss guards pull their pikes on them?
Well, I think they politely asked. They were at this. We're talking of World War II, and this is in June of 1944 when Rome is captured by the Allies, and the Vatican was in general overwhelmingly relieved to have the Germans flee, of course, because they were in danger. I mean, they were the Nazis were even threatening. They were threatening to even kidnap the Pope. Had been discussed. So they were happy to see the Americans and the Allies coming. But we did kind of, overstep a boundary there. But we, retraced our steps, shall we say?
Yes. Now you take the record right back. I mean, for some of us, of course, the proudest moment was when essentially it was Canadian forces burnt the White House in 1812. So, right. Apart from that, most of American military involvements have been Americans going elsewhere rather than dealing with actual invaders on American soil. And you're sort of fairly dispassionate about this. I mean, you're not going into gung-ho patriotism. You're just making a dispassionate statement of who was involved and who wasn't and why and when, aren't you?
That's right. We really tried not to write a political or partisan book. My co-author and we don't even share the same politics, which I think was an advantage of the book. I mean, if you were just to Google and do a search on American invasions or how many countries has America invaded, you'll find a lot of kind of partisan rants. And we did not want to add to that collection. We wanted to present the facts and let the readers make up their minds for themselves of whether they think these were good ideas, bad ideas, or a bit of both.
Yeah, I mean, well, I suppose it must have helped having a non-American co-author, because even with the best will in the world, we all develop a degree of insularity and assume we're on the side of the angels.
That's right. And we certainly didn't want to demonize any country, any single country, or, do a kind of a enemies, bad guys, good guys, cowboys and Indians type of approach to history. We wanted to be respectful of every country, but at the same time accurate, and present, kind of the full panoply, and let readers make up their own mind about the wisdom of these various invasions and incursions.
You have a very useful table at the end with invaded or fought in. And military involvement, you distinguish. Right. So the Vatican City incursion is military involvement. It wasn't an actual invasion, since they only accidentally strayed in, I presume.
Right, that's right. I mean, if you just talk about like military involvement, you think about Portugal. We haven't invaded Portugal, but Americans have had bases in the Azores since World War II. They were founded to combat German submarines in the South Atlantic and in the Atlantic Ocean, but the point is that they're still there to this day. I mean, that we still have an American presence in Portugal. The gentleman who was recently was a hero on the train in France, who was in the Air Force. He's actually based in Portugal. So, I mean, he's one of the, many Americans. So that's, kind of another very recent example of an American military involvement that certainly is not an invasion. We haven't invaded Portugal, but we've been involved with them for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, people do tend to forget the famous song from the halls of Montezuma.
To the shores of Tripoli.
Tripoli, yes. This involvement was actually quite early, wasn't it?
That's right, and there have been. I mean, we mentioned early involvements. That they go predate, and America is sometimes perceived as an isolationist nation, has had an isolationist history, but in fact we have been involved, for a very long time. The very first American invasion that Stu and I managed to unearth took place in 1741. Which, of course, is before the United States was founded as a nation, before the American Revolution. And that involved about 3,600 American colonial troops that participated in the War of Jenkins' Year and that were involved with the assault on Cartagena. And one of those happened to be a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Washington, who was the older half-brother of George. And while the expedition was not a success, the commanding officer for that was Edward Vernon, Admiral Edward Vernon, whose nickname was Old Grog, you might appreciate. And
of course I do. He's the man who invented the rum ration. Or, in fact, he didn't invent it. They'd already been serving rum rations, and he actually, his revered memory, it wasn't that revered because he actually reduced the rum ration because he was worried about drunkenness, and he ordered it be watered down as well.
Yes, but he was, I guess, Lawrence must have been enamored sufficiently that he spoke highly of Vernon to his younger brother, and of course his younger brother ultimately ends up naming his home Mount Vernon in honor of the commanding officer of that first American invasion.
Well, one of the points here, of course, is that that was one of the wars. Vernon won several sea battles that won the wars against the French that ended the threat from Canada. I mean, it was after one of those that the grateful citizens of New York erected an equestrian statue of King George III downtown.
Yes. No, it's a long, complicated history, and of course George Washington, was involved in the 7 Years' War and fighting in the Ohio River Valley against the French on behalf of George III. Again, so yes, there have been obviously deep ties between the mother country and the United States.
So, I mean, what was the? what was the most surprising of your invasions from your point of view? I mean, were there some that which sort of totally blew you out the water, as it were?
Well, I think the thing is that people tend to think of war as a horrible and costly thing, and of course it is. But there are. Well, I guess what's surprising is that there are different types of wars out there, and that there are many things that are subsumed under the word war. And while most wars are horrible and costly and expensive and in blood and treasure and so forth, there have been some what I would call ridiculous wars, and I mean such as the Pig War, which it's called a war, the Pig War in 1859 between America and Britain, and which was fought in my home state of Washington on the San Juan Islands, and the only casualty of that war was porcine, was a pig. So and of course that ended up not turning into a full blown war, but there was an escalation and there was danger. And what I think is interesting from a historical standpoint is the what if of that war. Is that what if there had been a conflict between Britain and the United States in 1859? Would that have postponed perhaps the onset of the U.S. Civil War if Americans were focusing on Britain rather than their own internal conflicts? Who knows?
This is Ian Williams with the Catskill Review of Books, and today I'm talking to Christopher Kelly about his book America Invades, or How We've Invaded or Been Militarily Involved with Almost Every Country on Earth. In fact, I did look up Seward, the Secretary of State who bought Alaska had great ambitions on Canada as well, and during the Civil War at one point the British rushed thousands of troops across because they felt that the Union might well decide to invade Canada as well. And there were people here who wanted to do that, of course. Right.
I mean, I mentioned in the book that I have a couple of ancestors who both fought in early invasions of Canada. One was James Van Rensselaer, who was at the Siege of Quebec in 1776, and his commanding officer was Benedict Arnold. And that invasion was unsuccessful. The Siege of Quebec was unsuccessful. And then another invasion was later by Stephen Van Rensselaer. It was led by Stephen Van Rensselaer, another ancestor of mine, who led the militia, New York militia, during the War of 1812, which also attempted to invade Canada again.
It was very half-hearted, wasn't it? Most of the New England states were threatening to secede from the Union because they thought it was a stupid, pointless war that was bad for trade as well.
It was a very unpopular war, especially in New England and the Northeast. And yes, no, there was the Hartford Convention. It was a politically divisive war, to be sure.
In fact, Stephen Harper, who is otherwise the most rabidly pro-American prime minister that Canada's ever had, actually, I think he put up 20 million Canadian dollars to commemorate the 1812 war as a sort of founding, uniting action by Canadian troops at the time.
Right. And I mean, there were, other presidents who cast their eyes on Canada. I mean, Polk was famous for, 54-40 or fight, and of expanding the border northward into what's now British Columbia, and, arguing that border. When he did come to office, he ended up turning his attention south rather than north. And in fact, we fought a war with Mexico instead of Canada. But initially he did have designs on Canada. And, Thomas Jefferson said that, the invasion of Canada would be a mere matter of marching prior to the War of 1812. A serious misunderestimation.
Yeah, so the snowbirds won that argument. who wants a few thousands of square miles of frozen tundra on the Great Plains?
Exactly. Voltaire that said, why are we fighting over a few acres of snow in Canada? Exactly. Yes.
Uh-huh. Well, the Canadians, it's one of the great things of history you're mentioning, the what would have beens, is that I believe the French king was offered the choice between Canada and Martinique in the treaty and decided to keep Martinique.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for the beaches. But if I were Quebecois, I'd feel quite miffed about this, So, is there any pattern between these? Obviously, the pace of American military involvement has been stepping up over the years, since the Cold War started and even afterwards, hasn't it?
The pace, certainly we have been more outgoing, more involved in the rest of the world with World War II, subsequent to World War II. Obviously, the United States has alliances, is a part of NATO, which involves itself with, many countries. I mean, it has many obligations. And then we have obligations in Asia as well. And Africa, for example. I mean, this is one thing that kind of surprised me in writing the book, is that we mentioned that there are only those three countries that we have not been involved with, which of course implies that we have been involved with every single country in Africa in some way, which in itself is, I think, kind of an astonishing fact.
As one, just checking your terminology, one of the ones that people forget about is Iceland. And you said involved or invaded or fought in. You have it in the no column, and I think there's a bit of haziness there, because the British did invade and took it over and then handed it over to the Americans.
Yes, we certainly were based there. We certainly had American forces there in World War II that were kind of occupying it, and also you had things. Obviously, Reykjavik was very important during the Cold War in 1986 with the Reagan-Gorbachev summit. So you had things going on in Iceland, but in terms of actually we didn't see it as actually an invasion. I mean Greenland nearby. Now there we actually did fight. Had a very. I mean, it's really kind of the smallest war in World War II. Their smallest army in World War II was the Greenland Defense Force, and there were Germans that landed in Greenland and were trying to set up weather stations to support their submarine effort, their U-boats. And there was conflict there. And then after the war, the United States, I was surprised in researching this in the book too, is that the United States actually made an offer to purchase Greenland too. And Denmark declined the offer. And instead, of course, they've leased out bases in Greenland at places like Thule, at the extreme edge of the world, where bases that are monitoring, the potential for nuclear missiles and all of that.
Yeah, I saw that. That was fascinating. I had not realized that I knew the Japanese had taken some of the Aleutian Islands, and there was the famous counter-invasion when we had a full-scale retaking, discovered there were actually no forces there waiting for us. If I remember rightly. But in the case of Greenland, the idea that they'd actually set up these stations on the Greenland coast, it makes you realize how remote it is that the Germans could actually set up clandestine weather stations there.
Yes, exactly. No, it is kind of one of those secret histories of World War II a bit there in Greenland.
That does remind me, I think it's in Gallipoli when the two people going to... The two guys are going to join up, and they meet an old stockman, and he says, why are you getting involved? Because the Turks will come here. And the guy looks around and says, let them have it. Let them have it.
Yes.
And it would certainly be my sentiment that they richly deserve Greenland. If they couldn't handle Stalingrad, what are they going to do up there?
I think the Danes made a pretty clever deal leasing rather than selling, though. I mean, that we're still leasing from the Danes to this day. Again, in terms of military involvement, is often persistent. That is in the case of the Azores, but that we still have bases in Greenland. Even though the Cold War is over supposedly, and the threats are supposedly have reduced, but they're still there and they're still monitoring, of course.
Well, there is a sort of pattern there, isn't there? That once you invite them in, they never go away. Just ask Fidel Castro in Guantanamo.
That's right. Yes. I think you can make, argument. Again, we try not to write a political book, but there are arguments, for and against military involvement. I think the biggest argument for continued persistent military involvement is, you take the case of Europe. That here we are this year celebrating the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, and that Europe, with the exception of the breakup of Yugoslavia, has had a remarkable period of peace of 70 years, with that one, major exception of Yugoslavia.
I was about to mention that one major exception, yes, although...
Yes. Yugoslavia is certainly an exception, but looking at the context of long-term European history, with two world wars, the Napoleonic Wars, 30 Years' War, 100 Years' War. I mean, the expectation in Europe was that your son might be drafted or conscripted to fight, the neighbor on the other side of the river or mountain. And for the past 70 years, that largely has not been the case.
Yeah, and in fact, I remember just before the Balkan Wars, just before I came over here, in fact, a classical-minded friend in a pub suddenly came in crowing that Europe had just had its longest period of peace since Marcus Aurelius and the Antonine Empires. It was not a comparison that sprung immediately to mind, and shortly afterwards, of course, the Goths did invade Yugoslavia pretty much.
Yes.
The former Yugoslavia. But, part of this is, how much of this is actual, I'm asking you to make some value judgments here.
Sure.
Part of this is, are these bases really necessary, or is it the Pentagon is really acquisitive and doesn't like letting go of real estate and jobs and prestige? Once it's got its grips in there, every base you build is a job for somebody in the Pentagon, I presume.
Right. I mean, it's true. But if you take the example of going back to Portugal and the Azores, and I've researched this, that, I mean, is the presence of Americans in Azores, to the extent that it's controversial, is really controversial in Portugal. In the sense that they're worried that if the Americans go away, they're going to lose jobs, and that it's going to have the Azores doesn't have a lot except for tourism and some military bases, and so for them. From the perspective of the Azorians, the Portuguese, it's largely desirable that they stay. Now, obviously, that's not true everywhere in the world. And
Okinawa seems to be a case in point. I gather there were demonstrations there this week again against the bases being rebuilt.
Sure. And the thing is that when you put bases, the American soldiers that are in South Korea are there as a tripwire in case of a North Korean invasion, clearly. I mean, that to involve us more deeply in a conflict in the event that there was some kind of flare-up there. And, I mean, to the extent that when you have American bases in many, many countries now today, and more than ever before in Africa, that we alluded to earlier, that, I mean, there's the potential that you could have American casualties taken in countries that most Americans, have never even heard of.
Certainly couldn't spell in some cases.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about the South Korea one, of course, is that in some vague technical way, they are actually serving under the UN command. The UN, Panmunjom, it's the UN flag flies on the frontier, and the commander still makes an annual report to the Secretary General here in New York about what he's done.
Right. And that war has, technically never ended. It's just kind of a truce. And there's this long DMZ. And so, but I mean, when we talk about invasions, I mean, clearly, of course, we have invaded Korea, and not just South Korea, with MacArthur in the Korean War, landing at Incheon, but also we drove all the way up to the Yalu River in the course of that war. Bob Hope did a concert in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, at one point. So
he even beat what's the Slovenian rock group that's just in a concert in Pyongyang.
Yes,
singing highlights from The Sound of Music, I think it was. So I don't know what Bob Hope sang.
Yes, but so I mean, and the thing is, you can say, well, have we invaded Korea? Yes, we have, and you can make the point that Korea today, that South Korea, because it is a divided peninsula, and Americans take for granted things like Hyundai cars and Samsung cellular phones, and all of that might not be possible in the event that North Korea had actually prevailed in the Korean War, and there had been no South Korea left to produce all these products, including Psy, for the entertainer, the singer Psy, who happens to be quite anti-American and against the American military too.
Yes. Well, there's quite a strong degree of resentment. The U.S. forces in these countries sometimes have difficulty distinguishing foes from friends.
Yes. I think that you have to ask about things like, like this whole process of after World War II of denazification. Of if America had simply in 1946 withdrawn from occupied Germany. Is there the possibility that fascism might have made a recovery there? Or is there a relationship between the American military presence and, say, neo-Nazis in Germany today? I mean, if America pulled out altogether from Germany, would neo-Nazism increase, stay the same, or decline? I think these are interesting questions.
Well, I think it's sort of settled on the lines that Uncle Joe Stalin would have quite made sure that there were no Nazis left, unless they joined taking out Communist Party cards afterwards.
Right. If the Soviets had just marched into, if we'd withdrawn and the Soviets marched in, I'm sure you're right.
Who was it? There's a British minister who said that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out.
Exactly. That's a great quote. Yes.
Which of course, since you're in London, Jeremy Corbyn is wrestling with at the moment. Do we still need all of these things?
Right. And the thing is that I think that the book could be of interest to people regardless of their political persuasion, whether they think there should be, far less American involvement or even more American involvement, which is sometimes almost hard to imagine, but is possible. I mean, certainly there are countries we haven't invaded yet, and who knows? It could be that the book requires new chapters in the future. So.
Do you remember the Duchy of Grand Fenwick?
Of course, sure. Yes.
With Peter Sellers masterminding trying to provoke an invasion.
That's right.
and winning.
What can happen is to be defeated by the United States and then rebuilt.
Yes. Yes. It's a wonderful film, that. It's one of it's Peter Sellers at his classic best.
Yes.
Playing every role. Yes, he's obviously practicing for Dr. Strangelove for another military involvement as well.
Sure, of course, yes. Of course. Yes.
You have another book coming up, don't you? Italy Invades?
I do. Just around the corner, actually, next month, our book, Italy Invades, How Italians Conquered the World, is going to be coming out. And it seemed to be kind of a natural successor. My colleague Stu did the British story. Together we did America. And then now we're going back to Italy in a very broad sense, including Rome. And of course, Rome had an impact on... As conquering
and invading go, yes. they went.
Yes, and Rome was the model for the British Empire. And in so many ways, Rome has an influence on America today. From our having a Senate and our Capitol buildings, and to having an eagle as the symbol for the United States.
Yes, and having assassinations in the Forum. Yes, we took the lot, not to mention blood games and circuses.
Yes, and the old English public schools where they were force-fed Latin and had to learn Caesar in order to maintain the British Empire. It was similar things. Yes.
Christopher, that's all we have time for. This is Ian Williams, and I've been talking to Christopher Kelly about his book America Invade: How We've Invaded or Been Militarily Involved with Almost Every Country on Earth. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you, Ian.
Listen in next week to the Catskill Review of Books from WJFF in Jeffersonville, New York.